Hello, everyone. Close your eyes for a second and imagine that we are in a dark room. Her voice surprised one sound coming out from of nowhere while the video screen remains fades to black. A few seconds and the first image appears. The artist's voice continues further, and as further image come, I barely remember what she said, but I recall stories, characters, and meanings. The title of the work is Constructing History, a requiem to mark the moment by artist Carrie Mae Weems. As perhaps many of you know, this work comprises a series of photographs and video installation in which we review some of the key historical turning points that have come to represent crucial watershed of our times. I wonder after what she said today if she will reinvent some of this imagery. But we'll see in a minute representations of the assassination of leaders such as John F. Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, and Benazir Bhutto, as well as the deaths of innocent people in Hiroshima, Birmingham riots, which are recovered from history books and archives that overwhelm spectators with the brutality of the memory they represent. The images are mixed on the one hand with a crowded classroom. Let me just click this. With a crowded classroom in which students sit facing empty teachers' days or looking through the windows. And on the other hand, the dreamlike woman whose gaze is lost in an impending snowstorm. On one of the exhibition walls, we can read, and let me back to it, the sentence, if given the opportunity to change history, what would you do? The artists, while rescuing historical episodes and figures from oblivion, ask viewers in turn to project their own desires and expectations onto the process of production history. It is a strong metaphor of ideological discourse that calls one to action, announced by the most lucid intellectual. It is indeed an organic intellectual statement. Bodies of words like the Carrie Mae Weems, that artist Carrie Mae Weems, have always enriched my knowledge and my persona successfully. There is something about the way in which these multifaceted artists narrate untold stories, something about the strength with which she claims a space for certain figures to be heard, to be remembered, that always brings to mind a type of social and political avowal. Over the past years as curator, I have ensured my sympathy for artists' endeavor reinscribing certain subjects in history, subverting dominant discourses from inside the codes these are criticizing, created a legitimate reading of overlooked episodes instead of establishing a new history that falls outside of the so-called official history. And in doing so, artists like Carrie Mae Weems transform the way that we perceive history altogether, transform and call for that history to be reinvented. I realized that, when one's respond to Weems' inquiry, we need to consider whether we are, in a way or another, capable of changing history, of interfering in history making. Seems an unreachable utopia. However, we know somehow that any possible attempt towards the change will modify the history yet to come and will force us to embody the role of the intellectual. But could any of us be an intellectual? I realized that in order to respond to all these questions, one needs to pull all her belongings up from a table, personal background, academic knowledge, professional choices. Obviously, any possible off-the-cuff responses emerging from that will need to come up against the more unavoidable question, like, for example, what is an intellectual? The artist a public intellectual? And if she is, what are the responsibilities that come along with that? And it's for that particular juncture, encompassing a point of personal uncertainty and questioning, that I will be interested in exploring some of not only the works of Carrie Mae that I believe need no introduction by what we are experiencing in the show here at Armory, but also what it means for any of us to be capable of intervening history making. And in doing so, I would like to take into formulation what I'm trying to do now, which is to reimagine the role that so much inspired the role of the artist as an intervener in history making, as an agent of history, as per the mission that I have come to terms recently, which is to work as a director at MACBA in Barcelona. Maybe some of you know the space, perhaps some others don't. What I think is interesting for me is how, for instance, people like Carrie Mae, but also anthropologists such as Michel Roth-Troyot have invited us to call upon silent stories, to unveil them, to really engage with an art of appropriation of that history, who think that there is some larger story to tell. There is no coincidence between, that is not the only coincidence between the scholar and the artist. For Troyot, the human beings participate in the history both as actors and narrators, and Wing highlights this participation by demanding her protagonist's awareness within that process, all of us together. They highlight the nuance inherent in the definition of the word history. Troyot refers to its ambivalence to support the assertion that history means both the fact of the matter and the narrative of both those facts, both what happened and that which is said to have happened. The first meaning places the emphasis on the socio-historical process, while the second rests on our knowledge of the process or on our story about the process. And in a way, I don't know if you believe that or not, but I had the feeling that the exhibition space and the museum offer a possibility to reinventing history in such a way. As you know, museums was, during colonial time, one of the elements that the colonial metropole used to count, to value the history, the culture, and the objects that refer to those beliefs and traditions of the other. And what we have been done in many, many aspects is to questioning such relationship, to questioning how we can make history. I was reminded of also another reference to the philosophical method of Henri Bergson, when he talks about how humanity makes its own history, avoiding obstacles, staging and solving problems, and that fact of becoming conscious of that activity is what provides human beings with the conquest of freedom. There is something about that freedom in my invocation of Francois Lyotard's notion of the enthusiasm, right? That so for within the historical experience of humanity, its progress towards the better. The enthusiasm itself, however, not as an ethical validity, but as a formlessness and without any possible purposelessness. A society open to transformation will have to be open a priori to a certain idea of progress, to a revolutionary thinking acquired via the neutralization of the conflicts and freedom carried out by the level that society, the civil society. And in fact, part of that enthusiasm shared not only by those that participate actively in the historical event, but those of us, or maybe those of you who have observed the event from the distant. The museum as an event, the museum as a space of knowledge, of course, as a vehicle of a plural desire, a fundamental tool to culture rooted in political action and social change. And that's the museum that I imagine. But there is a paradox in the production of the notion of the trompe-l'oeil, a long-studied phenomenon in our history that transformed our perception of a flat surface to create the illusion of three-dimensionality, while also referring to the potential to deceive precisely for the accomplishment of that feature. Hence, the trompe-l'oeil has always alluded to a sort of impossible escapism, forever trapped with the ontological limits of the canvas of the surface on which have been executed. Examples for history are countless, as we know. And, staging architectures, realistic perspective of imaginary landscape, frescoes suggesting unreachable worlds of the divine, or simply the representation of the back of a frame painting. This last instance is often presented as the ultimate example of the phenomenon, as it revealed the oxymoron quality of a highly poetical manner. The trompe-l'oeil may be thought as a reflexive strategy, however, that indicative of art's capacity to challenge both the beholder and the discipline at the same time, and which constitute the blank slate that offers a myriad of possibilities for self-criticism. And in the midst of this exercise resides the artist, convener of the make-believe, the creative mind aiming to move not only beyond the nature of the painting itself, but also beyond the reading of the painting as an object, as an act, as a field of knowledge, as a cultural production. The representation of that reverse of the verso symbolizes the unthinkable made possible, but also made apparent everything between the decision to perform such act and its fruition. In other words, it questions how the aesthetic turn comes about and why the painting and its limits are prospects' needs contested in the first place. The nature of painting, as well as the illusory nature of the trompe-l'oeil, have been repeatedly questioned through history of the discipline, and I'm not going to talk to you about that. But for me, there is an aspect interested in this configuration, which is the fact that in precisely this moment of an exhibition that I co-curator at the Fondazione Prada, where we are in the midst of two of the work of Giulio Paolino, where are constantly invited to lose ourselves in between the verso and the recto of these paintings. That for me symbolizes what a museum can do in a powerful and poetic way. The central display of these two, the Shemamusa and Alceo, refers to the relationship of these two characters in Greek history, but also the reinvention that is supposed to be in between these two, or an imaginary position in between these sides of the painting. As it does the picture for women that we saw before, of course, as it does the Le Bar de Folie Verger that we also saw. But let's think about what and how frameworks delimit, as it was said earlier, the way in which our artists and the humanity that is displayed within the work is trapped. As Carrie Mae reminds us in this particular piece in which she recovered the moment in which Robert Colescott was the first Black representative in the US Pavilion in Venice, and how both him and her are trapped by the sense of this crisis of the classical unity of the concept of the picture, of the modernist concept of the picture. But of course, let me also go to all the moments where we have seen Carrie Mae reinventing history as an open world, as a network of limit interrelation in which uncertainty could be a possible future, in which he have emotionally invite us to engage, to his openness, to history's incompleteness. History as a work in motion, displaying intense mobility and kaleidoscopic capacity to suggest itself in constantly renewed aspect to its consumer. This meaning of history that in the past I have referred to using Umberto Eco's notion of the open world present as history, as we also see in the hands of Sonia Boyce in this image here, as to be said to validate for a poetic principle, for a series of acts of conscience freedom. And how we could imagine this unfinished responsibility of not only our instrumental reworking or sort of presence of the halo of infiniteness that history could represent for us, is this sense of the relevance of the museum. And this is one of the things that I have considered and questioned for a long time when we were in the middle of the pandemic. How can our institutions be relevant to the context that surrounded? How can we engage in ways in which audiences can actually take ownership and appropriate the reality that the museum offers? A museum that, as I was saying earlier, has to be related with the context in which it is presented. If we imagine history as an open work, who will be the author and who is audience? In fact, would there will be a need for these categories at all? If one were to consider history as a work in motion, one will be requested to embrace the possibility of its incompleteness against the customary belief of history's uncertainty and objectiveness. And I use these pieces that I found fascinating of the work of Colin Smith that she had been publishing in her COVID manifesto through Instagram, and that she then uses in a project that we did together with Circa in the showroom in London, where during the month of November, after the third lockdown, I believe, I was established in the UK, we were prompted to go back to our houses, but every night at 8:20 for 2 minutes, her COVID manifesto, her memorialization of the fact that took place during the summer of 2020 in this country, took the narrative and the public space of Piccadilly Circus. And it's to that sense of the humanness, the humanity, the trace of the human in the context of the public space to which I want to devote the museum vision, for it to have the capacity to be transformed by the wishes and the desire of the people that surround it. And there is something that happened when we are invited to produce and I'm not gonna speak too much about MACBA. I want to bring a couple of moments in which I feel the sense of appropriation that are pursuing not only around the building itself or in the plaza, but also in the kind of exhibitions that we can bring, in the kind of history that we can build within the space of the museum. And I want to refer to certain moments that, as some of the images earlier that I was presented of Carrie Mae's project, social studies, or the recent COVID resist thesis, moments where MACBA, which was particularly prolific in something that was called or has been known as new institutionality, that was prompted, for me, the most important aspect of that, it was prompted not necessarily for the extraordinary exhibitions that my colleague did for many, many years, but also for the activities that they did as a public program, for the independent private program, for the moment of the museum as a thinker, the museum as an agency, the museum as a capable of transforming this sense of openness and indeterminacy that history and the production of history has embedded into it. And it was not only because they presented ideas and thought, but because they intervened the street that so beautifully, Carrie, you had done for so many years. No? I was thinking of how many beautiful images about the project in Lincoln Art Center that populated also the streets of Cardiff during the Artis Mundi award. But there is, as Troyos said, and as Carrie present us, I remember also Audre Lorde, no? There are artists that are asking us if we are doing our job. Present us, Troyos says that, you know, alongside professional historians, there are other participants in the production of history that even though they might not destabilize the system of powers, will add complexity to it. And Troyos insists that have existed and still exist silence episodes in which only non-historians are capable to emerge as actors and narrators of histories. And I want to use, again, this sense of the public space. Maybe you can launch now for the last few minutes. I'm going to finish and then you can leave the video for my last 3 minutes, which I think they're coming very soon, right? I just wanted to say that one of the important aspects in bringing the museum to this moment in time, because I feel like it has been delayed for some sort, which also implies, for instance, the use of our public space, which is right in front of Magba Plaza, in which we hope is going to be an extraordinary installation and a great museum that will allow the plaza to have a space cover, but also for the plaza to enter to the space of the museum. I'm hoping that the museum or the expansion of the museum will signify the symbolic embracement of the collective and the context that surrounds the museum, and that I feel that for the past 10 to 15 years have been somehow in a difficult dialogue, okay? And this image that I was showing is part of the dialogue. We were called upon this fact that renewing the building, expanding the building, we will be limiting the use of the plaza. And then we decided that then, working with the architects, that this part that you see on top of it, this public terraza, will allow not only to recover these 1,000 square meters that we were taking out of the plaza, but also give a different use to the public space of the museum. And if you want, you can launch the video now. I'm gonna just thank you. There is a lot of things that I wanted to say.
Okay, 3, 2, 1, let's jump.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Iris Dressler. This is Hans Christ. We together are the directors of the Württembergischer Kunstverein. I know it's impossible to spell and pronounce that. And we are planning to explain a little bit not only what we are doing, but especially how we understand our role and our responsibility of being the director of quite a big institution in Stuttgart. This Kunstverein was founded in 1827 in a time where Germany still consisted in little kingdoms, and it was part already of the nation-building process in Germany. It is a sort of private association, but completely publicly funded and by members. But we are much more independent in what we are doing than a museum like the MAGBA is, for example. We have no collection, so it means that we basically are a place, an exhibition place. We also have a studio house, and yet we think what we are is much more than just a place to show exhibitions. This is the way, yeah. For example, for us, it's also important to tell you where we actually are. We are in Stuttgart. This is a city of 600,000 inhabitants, and we are placed, this is the Württembergischer Kunstverein. It's in the very, very center of the city. You have here the main shopping street, and we have here the park that starts directly. So we are squeezed in between these two parts of the city. This is the regional parliament. This is the opera house. So it's a kind of specific situation there also, which is important to us because, of course, we are not just a closed system. Every museum, every institution is somewhere and has a connection to its direct surroundings as it has to global context. This just to tell you again the space. So it's a very wide cubish space of 180 by 180 feet. And this part, which is the entrance, but also a sort of shared space, which is very, very important as actually our exhibition space, and Hans will talk more about this later. So Elvira and we share not our love for Carrie Mae Weems' work, but also for this guy, Dan Pejovsky, which is a fantastic Romanian drawer who is actually accompanying my life every day. So we are directors of the Württembergischer Kunstverein since 2005, which is quite a long time. We are pretty much engaged in the social political context of contemporary art. And as we, from the very beginning, and that was in 2005, still very new in German Kunstvereine, it was very important for us to open up our perspective and go beyond the German, but also the Western European art discourse. And as we wanted to do this, it was for us very important to do this, not only the two of us, but of course invite artists, curators from all over the world to work with us together to revise what is actually what are the important discourses of contemporary art. So we started in 2005 a 2-year project called On Difference, where among others with Dan Pejovsky from Romania, we were thinking how we match with the local and the global, how we bring this together. And it was a really 2 years project, and that's another point which is very important to us. We started with 10 exhibitions a year, and then now we are with 4 exhibitions a year. And for us, it's very, very important to have time to work differently with resources, with money, with giving space for research, and not because we are as institutions, we are not no fashion stores. We don't need to show new clothes every 2 weeks. This is why I said yesterday decolonize, today disinfect, so that especially the discourse of decolonizing the institutions should take the next 500 years, because the history of colonization is 500 years, right? So that's nothing about dealing in 2 exhibitions. So sustainability is something which is quite important to us.
But maybe only shortly to add also, this working in this big collaborative teams has also to do that we, from the beginning, accept our gaps of knowledge. So this is very important. Collaborative working is to do something together and not to think that you can do it yourself. So only to add.
Yeah, sure. So I just said very easily we are concerned with the political context of the arts, but this of course is connected to many complex and many and constantly new questions. So what are really the relations between the political and the poetical? What are the specific poetical potentials and forces of the arts regarding emancipatory processes and the struggle for justice? We see this, of course, in this wonderful exhibition of Carrie. How can and should we as an art institution position ourselves within this struggle? What are our allies? Who is missing? And what are the limits? When we talk about one aspect, and we do many projects. I mean, we are working together since the mid-90s, so almost 200 years. So what we mean with the specific poetical potentials of art that we are interested in, and Elvira has talked already a lot about the history, and of course we are very interested in artistic methods and languages of deconstructing the hegemonic narratives of modernity and its origins in capitalism and colonialism, and how these modes of deconstruction reveal what is missing, and how they reveal the contingency of the dominant historic narratives, and how they think through this past and future differently. These are artists we are interested in, like, for example, Stan Douglas we worked with together with the Staatsgalerie in 2007, and who, of course, this is just a very simple example. In his work Suspiria takes the narrative or the story or the book Das Kapital from Karl Marx and reads it against the fairy tales of the Grimm brothers. Or we had worked together with the curator Ute Vorküper about the artist Anna Oppermann, a German artist who died already in the mid-90s, and who made these huge, incredible installations that were questioning the theories and of especially Western German philosophers, and asking it through feminist questions, and doing these incredible installations as a sort of constantly growing diagram of her questions, of her feminist questions to these discourses.
This is called being different, and also to add, it's very important, there was never an ensemble in her entire lifetime as an artist which were finished. And then also another aspect in this exhibition, it was 14 years after her death, it was also to take the responsibility of an interpretative reconstruction. We closed the institution for 2 months and gave the art historians and the science who were working on the object of Anna Oppermann to research, to scan, and to save the body of work. And this was also then the step that this is a typical female position which should have entered the museums in the 1980s. She was quite known. But of course, other big painters made it, especially also in the German museums. We know all the names. So that this was then also the exhibition, the starting point to save the body of her work. Right? So.
Then another artist is another German artist, Alexander Kluge, which this project was in collaboration with La Virena in Barcelona. We have very close connections to Barcelona and Spain, even though it's a German artist, so it was first in Spain. And he's a generation, he was the assistant of Fritz Lang. He was a close friend to Adorno. He was very important also in the student protest of the 67, 68. And he's very, his rereading of history is very much focused on the German painful history of the 30s, for example. And what he does is basically dealing with what he calls bifurcation. So he's going back to history, to this really painful German history, and looks for a moment of emancipation that could have led to another future, to another present. This is an exhibition we did with him, which was also challenging because he's actually a writer and a filmmaker, and how do you translate this to an exhibition space? Then something we are doing next year, and of course Carrie and Elvira has talked about this, is deeply, deeply going into history and the history of violence, confronting it with the history and the histories of resistance, looking for who is missing, etc. We see this so brilliantly in this exhibition. I don't know, how much time do we have still? It's okay. So in the beginning, I also go back to one very early project that actually started already in 2007, also to show a little bit how we work collectively and what we mean with a certain kind of sustainability in our work. So this project, Subversive Practices, was about art of the 60s to the 80s in South America and Europe, conceptual positions that were established in situations of political repression, and who came from a completely other historical background than what has been at that time the canon of conceptual art. And we were working with a group of curators, which at that time, on the one hand, especially in South America, were very young. It was the period when the conceptualisms of the South, this network was just built, and who, like Miguel Lopez, for example, or Fernando Davis, who started to rediscover artists that have really not been part of any discourses. And at the same time, artists and curators and art historians from Hungary, for example, from a slightly older generation, dealt with the conceptual positions of their areas. And what we did was basically show a sort of snapshot of the research at that moment. So it didn't say this is a solution of, or this is the new history, but it said these are the different questions that at the moment are put in this context. So you see some, I just go through it. And among others, Emilio Tarazona and Miguel Lopez were dealing with the context of Colombia, and it was for us, Peru, sorry. And it was interesting because they were in their 20s, and for them it was so important to go back to the 60s, to the 80s, and say there must be a history that we connect with. There's nothing, and it was for them really an urgency. So they started to ring at the doors of artists like Teresa Burger and say, we are interested in your work. And Teresa said, what? Because she stopped in the 80s producing art because she was so frustrated. And they did such a great work. And this was, for example, part of this exhibition. And then they developed a whole solo exhibition with Teresa Burger, and then we, just to connect to this first exhibition, we brought this also to Stuttgart, and the gallerist Barbara Thum, that we know all very well, started to work also with her, and then she got to the Venice Biennale. She started even to work again, to work as an artist. And also, unfortunately, she passed away this year through COVID, through this. And another artist we were showing later was Sergio Ceballos. I just wanted to tell with this that we really try to not have to not change the subject every 2 years, but really to keep on working with several artists, curators, discourses, contexts. Then what are the institutional limits? So sometimes we also, especially when we work in the political fields, we need to be very careful how to not absorb, for example, if we work together with activists, for example, how to not absorb what they are doing. And I make it very short, but I show this image, what I like so much, it's from 1968. It shows the ruins of the fourth triennial of design in Milan, and which for me is, it should be taught actually at curatorial classes, this exhibition, because I think it's very important. What has happened? So it's 68, well, Paris, you know. And
City.
yeah, not only Paris, but it's this moment of upheaval of young people who are not accepting the situation all over the planet, and it's this special moment in Paris. And what this triennial did, they showed props of barricades. And of course, the students felt totally ridiculized. They felt absurd. They were angry, very, very angry. So they went there and they destroyed the whole exhibition so that it even could open. And they occupied the space, and they used it for what they had to discuss at that time. And I think besides the fact that I think that the museum in ruin can be also a very good starting point to maybe also in a critical sense recapitalize what we want to do and what our role is. I think we need to listen to, I mean, this was one very radical example, but we need to listen to the critique that we receive. And we must think how we avoid to absorb or commodify emancipatory processes or the struggle for justice. How can we learn not to speak about, but nearby, as Cintivina says? And how do we listen to and how do we include other voices? What is our responsibility? This is a question that comes again and again, also regarding artists and other art workers. I mean, we saw with the pandemic how precarious this art market is. What does it mean, actually? Regarding our public, who is present, who is missing, and why? And at least also regarding local and global conflicts, because I'm convinced that we as art institutions are quite powerful. I mean, we have something to say, we have power, we have influence, and we should deal with that very responsible. And
okay. My chance. So, in a way, what is Iris showed already when we saw the floor plan, there was the entrance hall. And to make it very short, we have there 80 evenings, days, workshops, etc., etc. And this is this place is working very simple, like with a blackboard. People can come if they are not sexist, not racist, etc. They can come, they can have the space for free, and they can work there. And that it's now such an intense program over every third day something happens there. It's not because we ask them. This is very important. They realized in this typical European central city of 600,000 inhabitants, at a certain point they realized that they could have a space in the center. And then they start to come by themselves. So it's not that the bourgeois institution asking the Antifa to make program. The Antifa says by themselves, we need for this moment representation. We use you. And then with COVID, of course, it was not possible to give this central space. So we built this very simple structure. We didn't discuss too much about design. You see that outside on our sculpture yard. The nice aspect is that it's still part of the institution. So the police who is in the park, going behind migrants by racial profiling massively, it's not like here, of course, but checking your bags, taking down your trousers, regular, and you could see who is checked. So this was happened then there, and then there was a riot in the park by these young people last year. And then the city started to close spaces for them. And then we said, okay, we open one. So we opened this platform, and we done that also not naive, because I can't go there at night in the group of the people as a white, male, carnivore eating European. They kick me immediately out. But we already have had a lot of contact with the so-called Migrantifa, and they started also to be there at night, etc., etc. But they also made their programs. They used the platform, at one example, also in the context of the Memorial Day for the 9 people who were shot in Hanau by neo-fascists. So the space became this open platform and was clearly political connotated, and it was not important immediately to connect that with the issue of art. This is something, these are very slow food processes. You can't program them, you can't advertise them, you can't make any marketing out of this. This is simply what is, they take it in use by themselves. And of course, we also use it for us. So there was, with this pandemic, we have had this exhibition, actually the Dead Are Not Dead, Una Forma de Ser, curated by Maria Garcia Ruz and Pedro G. Romero. And this was very much about the politics and the fist. the party. So there is in the Romya culture, there is this moment when they have political gatherings, like it's called the gris, that all the political struggles which are discussed in the gris at the end ends in a fest, ends in a singing, ends in a different formation of telling a political story by a melody, by a voice, by a performance. And this was then happened also on this platform. And this is the last image of our presentation.
Thank you.
By the Institute, how your ideas have been shaped in terms of museum and practice and these sort of notions of where you are positioned in relationship to these institutions. How have they evolved? And I think that that's just interesting. So I'm just going to go over here and listen. That's mine.
Closer to you guys. No, thank you so much for that, Carrie. I mean, there is something very important, and I just joined MACBA 2 months ago, let's say. No, I joined in September, but really I was in between jobs, and I'm 2 months into my new moment at MACBA. And one of the things that happens to me is that I grow up parallel to the institution. And I feel like there is a moment now where some of the institutions in Spain, like the Guggenheim that will present Linné's work, or the Reina Sofia that will present Grada Quilomba and Ibrahim Mahama, where some people in Spain is catching up with the work that people like us has been doing for, as you say, 40 years, maybe I'm 20. 10, exactly. And we did together in Seville 10 years ago, no? And one of the things that is more important for me, and that's why I was saying this, is this, the feeling of appropriation. I had claimed not only my possibility of participating in history, but also to use in the museum, which is already, as you also say, that this beautiful synergy between our presentations, I love it. That the museum as a structure need to change, the definition of the museum need to change. I need to be able to do like you did with the art, while inscribing certain aspects, ideas, characters into the art making. I need to be able to do the same, inscribing certain, like what have been missing, no? And question the institution for what the ideological or conceptual paradigm that it created, particularly MACBA in the 1990s, no? Missed. No? What do they miss in that formulation? And one of the things that I'm trying to do with the museum, and I thought to bring you an aspect of what it is in terms of public program, but it will be much more obviously, is to do the sense of the inscription into the institutional history of the museum of certain stories, into the collection of certain artists, but also the context in which these aesthetics are generated. And as importantly, transforming the museum that is hoped to host this thinking cannot be the museum that inherit, because there is part of that museum that hasn't changed. So I had to redefine the museum in order for it to be able to host and to pay homage and to be present and in the present.
As I say, there's one I'm completely follow, but they, of course, doing that now over 15 years in Stuttgart, it's meant also that in the meantime, we have to speak about that. There are power structures, there are the boards. And in the meantime, our board has more activists than the representation of the bourgeois class. So it's a kind of a transformation also, which is not simply. I'm speaking here also as a director, and we speaking as directors, not only as curators. So that the entire infrastructure has to be transformed if we're speaking about the museum. This is no. It's not quick. It's not by name. It's not. It needs incredible a lot of time, and the pressure is also coming from the public. Yeah. This is then also the point that it's not implemented top down, but it's also partly bottom up. The other aspect is that we're speaking a lot about diversification and things like that. But at one example, when we done the Bauhaus exhibition, this was because there was in '68, the same year, there was the Bauhaus exhibition in our house, which created the trademark Bauhaus. Everything what was a post-war construction of the Bauhaus. And then we started to work on this exhibition, and we were looking for the how this wrong concept to believe that there was a school which was closed in 1933, and that there are not implications of this modernity also in fascism, also along the line of the biographies of the big teachers of the Bauhaus, like Herbert Bayer, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe. Etc. So that even when we're speaking about history, then in regard to a lot of these aspects, which seems to be the most canonized forms of history, we're still missing the critical perspective on it. So, okay.
I think that Hans is here now, actually. Is that right? Okay. Yeah. And I could listen to this all day. Because there are in this room, for the rest of the afternoon, I believe, a number of curators who are actually going to be speaking about, and museum professionals who are going to be speaking about what they're doing and their sort of role in sort of continuing this conversation. And maybe we might be able to come back a little later because there's actually a little bit of an opening this afternoon. There are a number of wonderful artists in the room who have also done extraordinary work in curating and bringing other artists together. Jennifer Sue, of course, is in the background, who's one of our advisors. And, of course, the extraordinary Magdalena Campos is here with us, who worked diligently and deeply around organizing a huge project with artists and bringing them to the the Cuban Biennale several years ago in Matanzas, the city of her birth and where her family resides. So there's a lot of knowledge in the room, a lot of people to talk to, and Magda, stand so that people who know who you are. Yeah. Good.
I want to use the opportunity, first of all, to say how honored always to be in the presence of Carrie, but I was talking to Elvira early. In this conversation of the space of the museum and the institutional frame, I want to bring to the attention your role and the role of artists who really are making interventions to rectify spaces that need to be activated by the artists. And I want to bring to the attention of the people in the room, Carrie Mae was the very first African-American woman to ever exhibit at the Guggenheim not long ago, 2014. And in that moment, Carrie brought to the Guggenheim the first convening, from where this convening now is a continuum. That convening was an incredible space of recognition and opportunity for an entire generation of Black artists from where the Guggenheim was not putting attention to that kind of activism and immediate actions to really rectify and enhance the institutional role. And I am thinking that you really started a movement. You really started a movement for what we don't have yet, the name. So I wanted to say that today, because I think that is important.
Well, you know, we do improv very well. You know, we never follow the rules. So Hans is coming? Yes. He is here, the brother is here, the man is in the house. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you all for being here. Incredibly excited to be here, because I always believe in these new formats of knowledge production. And of course, so many times before, Carrie has come up with an extraordinary format here, which is much more than a conference and such an amazing forum for exchange. When Carrie asked me to talk here today about a recent project, I wanted to talk about the conversations with my friend Edouard Glissant, the late Edouard Glissant, with whom I collaborated very closely the last 10 years of his life. And we have a little book which is here for all of you, which is distributed. I'm very grateful to Isolari. India is here from Isolari for making this possible. And it's the book of all the conversations I did with Edouard, and also actually drawings, sketches, doodles he made during our letter exchanges and dialogues. And when I talk today a little bit less maybe about the influence of Edouard Glissant, because I think it's interesting what Alexis Pauline Gams says in the wonderful book Dab about Sylvia Wynter, when she says it's not about genealogy, but it's about thinking with Sylvia Wynter. No? And I think in a way it's about thinking with Edouard Glissant, about working with Edouard Glissant. Edouard Glissant also as a toolbox, as it is for so many curators and artists now. And I've been thinking a lot lately again about Glissant, his activity as a poet, as a philosopher, as a public intellectual, as a curator, did not only encompass literary and theoretical work, but he consistently said that what matters is also the production of reality. So as a member of the resistance, he spoke out in favor of Martinique's independence from France, and then of course from 1967 onwards, through his institute Martiniquais d'études, a school which was an agent for change, he intervened in political issues and implemented Creole into a school system in Martinique mostly dominated by French. And later, and that makes Glissant of course so relevant for today's discussion about exhibitions, about museums, about curating, he actually imagined a museum as an archipelago. He worked very closely with artist friends on a museum for Martinique, an all-world institute, and that was an idea of actually an institution which would not host a synthesis, but actually a network of interrelationships. Glissant wanted to create a museum which would not only point at urgencies, but also find agency to respond to these urgencies. And he actually imagined it to be a quivering place which transcends established systems of thoughts. And in his own words, he was actually looking for the utopian point where all the world's cultures and all the world's imaginations could or can meet and also hear one another, which I think is a truly wonderful definition of what an art institution, almost a mantra, no? What an art institution can try to be in the 21st century. And he, of course, always said that it's about the archipelago. He wanted it to be an archipelago and not a continental structure. In Glissant's own words, from my conversations, I'm quoting him here, archipelagic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. That basically we can change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting the sense of self. And Glissant said it's archipelagic thought that teaches us this every day. So archipelagic thought, which endeavors to do justice to the world's diversity, which forms an antithesis to continental thought, which makes a claim actually to absoluteness. Continental thought, Glissant said, makes a claim to absoluteness. And actually continental thought tries to force its worldview on others, on other countries. Glissant said the archipelago is the opposite of that. So to counter the homogenizing forces of globalization, Glissant coined the term mondialité, globality, which is a form of worldwide exchange, which would actually recognize or preserve diversity and creolization. So he conceived this museum in a very close dialogue, actually, with artist friends, such as Wilfredo Lam or Roberto Matta, and it was intended as actually a place that would span the period really from the Mayas to the present. In Glissant's own word, the basic idea, he told me, was that he wanted to put together a historical and comparative encyclopedia of the arts of the Americas. Again, the archipelago had served as a model. Quote from Glissant, I imagine the museum as an archipelago, not as a continent. It actually accordingly would have housed not a synthesis, serving to standardize, but a network of interrelationships between various traditions and perspectives. And that's, of course, a critique he has of many existing museums, which attempt to house a synthesis again and again, and this synthesis often serves to standardize, whilst he wanted it to be a network of interrelationships. So also, maybe very importantly, he told me that the museum, he actually called it All-World Institute, that this All-World Institute would actually not illustrate previously established findings, but would function as an active laboratory. To quote Glissant again, it's not a recapitulation of something which existed in an obvious way, it's a quest for something we don't know yet. And it is always a critique of continental thought, because Glissant said if we are in continental thought, there is this danger of an obsession with the own image. It's the danger of projecting, actually, on the world universal ideas, and his museum was a critique of that. He said what we need is, with this institute or this museum, is the emergence of new forms of identification, new forms of identity, new formations in a way. And as Mantia Diawara, Glissant's friend and my friend, always said, it's about the formation in lieu of old universalizing models of filiation, of nationalism, and of continental thought. So it's actually an institution which would be relational and rhizomatic, and which would forge new and multiple identities. That again, a sort of interpretation from Mantia Diawara. Mantia and I have been working together very closely in interpreting Glissant's museum idea, and also with Assad Raza, I'm working on exhibitions to hopefully, create more awareness for that, and also hopefully, one day that this unrealized project can be realized. And it was really Glissant's wish that, Mantia and I would work on the occasion of his 80th anniversary. Glissant introduced me to Mantia Diawara and said that he wanted us to somehow come together and think about what such an institution could be. Now, interesting, of course, is also Glissant's emphasis in relation to this museum/institute in terms of the right to opacity. Actually, as he said, by understanding that it's impossible to reduce anyone, no matter what or who, to a truth they would not have generated on their own. I think a very important thought in relation to art institutions. So, and again, Diawara's interpretation that the same opacity is the force that drives every community, the thing that will bring us together forever and make us permanently distinctive. The idea also that every relation starts in opacity, that we have to admit that our identities depend on others, and that we build, and here we come back to that idea, against a universalizing reductive humanism, the theory of particular opacities, to accept the opacity of the other in all of its irreducible density. End of quote. Another thing, of course, which Glissant taught me and always emphasized is this idea that exhibitions and the way we show exhibitions are traditionally presented in a way that they are invisible to large sections of society, because they're actually behind doors, and there are doors in a way, as Glissant always said. And we need to kind of think about how we can go beyond these doors and think about other forms of engagement and new models of exhibitions that are more mobile and can go to the people. So how can we go with exhibitions to the people? And these are all thoughts which we try together at the Luma Foundation in Arles, the art center founded by Maya Hoffmann, which opened earlier this year, and where I was invited to present parts of my archive, and we actually began the archive presentation with an archive presentation of Edouard Glissant, of these dialogues. Here you see Couchonga's tribute to Edouard. You see the many different tapes of our conversations, the books we did together. And then, as I mentioned, these drawings, he actually mostly drew into books when he did these, when he signed books, but he also had these extraordinary handwritten notebooks. Here you see some of these very beautiful doodles. And we invited for Arles actually also artists to make homages to Edouard, to sort of show the connection. So here we have the late Etelatnan about repetition and difference, who did a Leporello. We have here the presentation of the videos, the films. I'm going to show you in a few minutes an extract of one of these films. We had them subtitled and translated, so to make these conversations with him accessible. It's a display by Katsuo Sejima with these rabbit chairs. So the idea is that whoever wants to watch it, it's kind of a one-to-one, no? Whoever is in the show is in a dialogue with Edouard. Here's some more of these videos. Here, actually, the last encounter with Edouard, I invited him when I moved in 2006 to London, to the Serpentine. The very first, basically, one of the very first public talks we organized was actually with Edouard, but Edouard said he would only come if he could be with his friend Linton Kwesi Johnson. And so there was this extraordinary, and it's also, as a video in the archive, extraordinary dialogue and poetry reading between Linton Kwesi Johnson and Edouard. And when we talked to Sejima about the Glissant archive, she said that there can actually only be a room if there is a window and a tree. So she planted a tree, and then Dominique Gonzalez-Förster created this image with the tree. And then, of course, we also commissioned these posters. You have here the series of posters we commissioned from artists. On the left is Glissant's own drawing of the archipelago, then the collaboration with Sylvie Glissant, who is a visual artist. They often collaborated on posters together. Julie Meretus, homage to Glissant, then Julien Creuset's homage to Glissant, then another drawing by Glissant, then Assad Raza's homage to Glissant, and then Philippe Pareno's telephone number he installed where one can ring and Edouard Glissant actually answers. So it's a French number, if you want to call the number. And that was actually, that premiered here when Gabriela Rangel, Assad Raza and I organized the exhibition at the Americas Society. And it's great that Gabriela is here, because that's where this poster actually premiered. Here you have Julie Meretus, amazing poster. Assad's amazing poster. The idea of these posters are, also that they can go into the city, and as Glissant said, the artworks can go to the people. Here you see some of these notebooks, which Glissant had, and which we also have in the exhibition. More of these notebooks and doodles. That's the drawing he made of the archipelago. So the archipelago is a passage and not a wall. The Antillean archipelago, in the archipelago, in the Caribbean archipelago, waiting for the Institute, right? That's this unrealized project. The Institute he wanted to happen, the Institute of our world. The roots are profound and never die. And this is the archipelago of Avignon, which is actually very near Arles. And this is the Rocher du Diamant. That's basically the idea. It has a lot to do also with the local, as he told me. And I think that's one thing I always felt so important in relation to Edouard's idea, is to kind of think about being rooted, no? And what it actually means to be rooted in a culture or in a country or in a city or in a community. And he said that this idea of being rooted is, of course, very important, but it is only important as long as it does not lead to the exclusion or annihilation of other people's roots, as long as it does not lead to the hierarchization and election of some roots and cultures over others. He told me we need to celebrate roots that expand elsewhere, roots that touch each other. They are not singular roots, they are roots that cover, and they are roots that protect some others. And I think, in terms of curating, in terms of exhibition making, that is an incredible definition of how we can connect to the local at a moment when his whole idea of mondialité is more important than ever, because he always said we live in an age of globalization, where the homogenizing forces of globalization lead to extinction and to an extinction crisis, not only an extinction of species, but also extinction of cultural phenomena. So we have to resist that. But he said we also face the risk of a counter-reaction to this globalization. And that counter-reaction would actually lead to new forms of nationalism, new forms of lack of tolerance, new forms of localism. And that's actually the last thing, Bernard Stiegler told us when he came to us. He said, how can we be local without being localist? So I think that whole idea mondialité, and the way I just quoted him about the local is another super relevant idea. And here another text about Monsieur Toussaint, the liberator of Haiti, died in the far in the Jura, assassinated by Bonaparte, that his memory live forever in friendship. Edouard Glissant. So here's the little book. And of course, this whole idea of having exhibitions which go to the people, of disseminating exhibitions, has something which inspired most of my projects ever since the 90s. So for example, Do It came directly out of the conversations with Glissant when we asked artists since 1993 to contribute instructions and recipes and how-to manuals which can be interpreted in many parts of the world. And this is an exhibition which is global, but it's also local, because wherever it goes, we make a local research, more and more instructions are added to the archive. There are so far more than 500 instructions from all continents, and it's really a direct kind of application maybe from, because I read every morning, 50 minutes of Edouard Glissant, and so in a way it sort of it goes into literally everything I do, and that clearly, yeah, I now do sometimes. And so that's actually the beginning of Do It. It began with Christian Boltanski, and this whole idea of exchanging the album, the photo album, with a neighbor. One piece from '93, the other one also from '93, that we get a neighbor's photo album and give the neighbors ours in exchange, and leads to an apartment exhibition in a way. Of course, Yoko Ono has worked with instructions, for a very long time with the Grapefruit Book, so that's the wish tree. So these were early in the 90s, first instructions. González Torres and this the instruction of Carrie Mae Weems, which is from 2019, an instruction I encourage you all to do. It's an urgent instruction. And then Kelsey Lou. Also, there's lots of rituals in it, in the Do It projects, and prayers, and as I said, it's in a way a project which will never end, because it kind of is also long duration. So it's been going on now for 30 years, and has never, there has never been a moment when there wasn't a Do It project somewhere. And a lot of people are also doing their own Do It, without us knowing it. So it's very open source in that sense for everyone. Here, a very recent instruction from Virgil Abloh, whom I want to remember here. Evan Ifekoya. This is a whole new series of Do It's we commissioned during the lockdown in 2019 in Cheng. And Precious Okoyamon inviting us actually to do a garden. It's maybe the beginning of the garden which is now growing in Aspen at the Aspen Museum, which Precious did. And then, of course, Glissant's, and that's maybe the last point I want to mention. Glissant also often talked about the necessity to find safe spaces between planetary and social boundaries for the planet, and the necessity actually to think about sort of a vegetation, a sea, landscapes being characters as important as a human being, kind of being an activist of the environment, as he called it, of the natural surroundings. And of course, Mantia Diawara is, as we speak, pursuing that idea of an aesthetic of solidarity in terms of the environment, being in in Senegal and working on this extraordinary film, where in a very Glissantian way the film actually produces reality in terms of Mantia working with a community to kind of save an entire community near the sea actually from environmental disaster. And that aspect is something we discussed a lot with Mantia, the kind of Glissant as an activist of the environment. That led us to do Remember Nature, which is a book where we continue to do it from an environmental, point of view. So these are all also new instructions which we did, which we commissioned this year. Here is Apichapangs or Anones. Or Asadrasas. Caroline Smith. Cooking sections. There are 140, so I just chose a few. And of course, a tribute also to Etel Adnan, whom I want to remember here. The poet who passed away age 96 2 weeks ago, and was in many ways also a mentor of mine. And we worked on so many projects because Etel expanded really the notion of single disciplines, bringing together drawings, films, notebooks, novels, paintings, poetry, cartographies, plays, as well as journalistic and teaching works, sculptures, architecture, and also tapestries. So here you have basically the Dewey piece by Etel, John Jonas. It's a quote from Halldór Laxness, the Icelandic writer, no, of Under the Glacier. It's from about the disappearance also of the glaciers. Shota Mombasa. And I thought we could end here with, actually, here is Mantia's text, no, on the poetics of solidarity. That really is almost, that text is almost, in a way, a synthesis of all these reflections on the environmental aspect of Glissant's work. And I thought we could maybe end by looking at a short clip, no, of the video, of one of these videos. And it's basically Eduard's talk at Utopia Station. He talks about utopia, and it's very fascinating because when we did the Utopia Station with Rick Ritiavanit and with Molly Nesbitt, we went first to Eduard and asked him about utopia, and Eduard said that he was very critical of this idea of utopia because he said he criticized this, classical utopia, such as Plato's Republic or Thomas More's Utopia, as static systems, no? And he basically wanted a new form of utopia as a continuous dialogue. He particularly, and it's actually one book of Glissant I wanted to recommend to you all. It's my favorite, one of my favorite books by him. And it's a book which is not so frequently read. It's a book called Sartorius from 1999. And it's an incredible novel because it describes the utopian Batutu people that derive identity not from genealogy, but solely from being in constant exchange with others. So Glissant refers to the utopia as a quivering or trembling utopia because it transcends established system of thoughts and subjects itself to the unknown. And here a quote from Glissant about utopia. It must be said from the start that trembling is not uncertainty and it's not fear. Trembling thought, and in my opinion every utopia passes through this kind of thought, is first of all the instinctive feeling that we must reject all categories of fixed thought, and that we must reject all categories of imperial thought. The all-world trembles, Glissant told us, the all-world trembles physically, the all-world trembles geologically, the all-world trembles mentally, the all-world trembles spiritually, because the all-world is looking for the point, not the station, but the point, the utopian point, where all the world's cultures, all the world's imaginations can meet and hear one another without dispersing or losing themselves. And that's maybe the transition to this short video clip, which we can watch for a few minutes. And I just wanted to thank again Carrie and congratulate Carrie on this amazing exhibition. And thank you all for being here. And also thanks so much to the Armory and my friend Tom Eccles. Thank you all so much.
Good afternoon. We are very happy to welcome Edouard Glissant, who has already contributed in the most wonderful way to our Poughkeepsie gathering, which was one of the previous Utopia meetings, preparing actually the Utopia station in Venice. And when we had this discussion actually to prepare. Edouard suggested that rather than doing a monologue or a conference, he'd like this to be a conversation. So I just wanted to start with the first question, basically following up where we ended in Poughkeepsie. Because when Edouard spoke in Poughkeepsie, he was talking about this notion of the tremblement, utopia as a tremblement. And I wanted to ask Edouard if you could tell us a little bit about this notion of the utopia tremblement.
Il faut dire d'abord que, avant d'expliquer ce que c'est que la pensée du tremblement, il faut dire d'abord que le tremblement, ce n'est pas l'incertitude et ce n'est pas la peur. Ce n'est pas ce qui nous paralyse. La pensée du tremblement aujourd'hui, et à mon avis toute utopie passe par cette pensée, c'est d'abord le sentiment instinctif qu'il nous faut refuser toutes les catégories de pensée figées et toutes les catégories de pensée impériale. La pensée qui s'organise en système et qui essaie de mettre de l'ordre, son ordre, dans le monde, est une pensée que nous devons non pas peut-être combattre, je n'aime pas tellement cette notion de combat, mais est une pensée contre laquelle nous pouvons élever cette pensée du tremblement, qui n'est donc ni la peur ni l'incertitude, mais qui est la connaissance ou la tentative de connaissance réelle de ce qui se passe à l'heure actuelle dans le monde, dans le tout-monde. Le tout-monde tremble. Le tout-monde tremble physiquement, géologiquement, mentalement, spirituellement, parce que le tout-monde cherche ce point, je ne dirais pas cette station, mais ce point utopique dans lequel toutes les cultures du monde, tous les imaginaires du monde peuvent se rencontrer et s'entendre sans se disperser ni se perdre. Et je crois que c'est ça d'abord l'utopie. L'utopie est une réalité où chacun peut se rencontrer et se rencontrer avec l'autre sans se perdre. Et ça, nous ne pouvons pas le faire avec les pensées impériales, les pensées de domination et les pensées du chemin systématique vers une vérité qu'on aurait posée d'avance et qu'on voudrait rejoindre le plus vite possible. La pensée du tremblement, c'est la pensée où on peut perdre du temps à chercher, où on peut flâner en route et où on peut opposer à tous les systèmes d'épouvante, de domination et d'impérialisme, on peut leur opposer cette poétique du tremblement qui nous permet d'être en contact avec le monde et avec les peuples du monde. Pour moi, c'est cela d'abord, la pensée du tremblement.
Many of the people we have been talking to over the past year are not sure that the idea of utopia is still productive. For you, Edouard, it still remains. Why do you think the word remains so strong?
It's because we must not think of utopia as a thing. Utopia is not an object. nor an objective.
Like a
It's
goal.
not, yeah, like a goal. Utopia is not a goal. Utopia is not a dream. Utopia is what is missing to us in the world. That's utopia. What is missing to us in the world. And I think that Deleuze, the French philosopher, said one time,
Yeah, I think maybe we should return. I need to find this quote again about what he told me about the local, no? And the idea that that he very much wants to talk about being rooted, no, in a culture, but it's just the way this happens, the way it's rooted, that he describes that it should never lead to the exclusion or annihilation of other roots, or to the hierarchization or election of some roots over others. So in a way it's about roots which he describes as being expansive, as touching each other, not singular roots, but actually roots that cover and protect. And it's interesting because we did ask him this question about indigenous knowledge, and he always said that is something we can learn from that he believes that we can learn the way he describes roots from indigenous wisdom. I mean, that was the answer he gave me to this question. Yeah, it's interesting that we can somehow connect it to Etel, no? Because Etel actually said that, and it's very kind of connected also to Glissant. She said that we need togetherness, not isolation. We need a common future. Not separation. And our last meeting was actually was a very moving encounter, because I went to visit her in early September in Bretagne, and she basically had this small apartment there. She and Simone Fattal, her partner, who is an extraordinary artist, and had this big exhibition here in New York at MoMA PS1. And so Simone and Etel, of course, at the moment, for those who haven't seen it, has a show at the Guggenheim, Kandinsky and Etel Adnan. And so Etel was just looking at the sea, and she basically spent the last months just drawing what she saw from the window. She did extraordinary leporellos, because she always did leporellos, where she brought together poetry and where she brought together her visual practice. But sort of at the very end of her life, she just painted the birds and the bay in Erki and the little boats. And we actually had a conversation about this idea of her life between geographies. So in a way, what leads to your question, the fact that she was in so many exiles, and of course she went to San Francisco during the Civil War and in Lebanon, and it's actually there that she sort of at the very end of her life at 96 said, when I asked her about the question about the belonging and about the idea, she said that somehow a mountain was her best friend. And yeah, she said that twice. She says, the Mount Tamalpais, I have never been there. Some of you might have been there. It's a mountain in the United States near San Francisco. And she said the Mount Tamalpais, she's never had a better friend than the Mount Tamalpais. And that's really, there's an extraordinary book she wrote also about that. And it's kind of, I was then thinking just before when I showed you the slides, I was actually thinking, the drawing of Glissant, of the Rocher du Diamant. I mean, that is a rock, in Martinique, near his house, and he would always talk about that. I mean, there's a whole book of Glissant called La Coe du Lamentin, where he basically talks about the fact that it's almost like this rock is his best friend. So that is.
we will in other ways. But I do have one question.
And he makes it. Oh, sorry. And he makes it, but everybody was. You could hear me. No, I was saying that in a way, for me, a MACBA that has a story is fixing a story, is fixing a building, we're expanding, but at the same time, it's fixing a tradition that saw Barcelona as a place where, this investment into an architecture that will change the surroundings will do the work, And when we are at the moment that I joined the institution, I feel like it didn't do the work, and it's up to us now to do it, but to do it sort of bringing this formlessness capacity that communities bring to institutions, from the bottom up. So my question to you is that not necessarily you have to have an answer.
Is there another question?
No, I can answer, but maybe someone else.
No, nobody's answering. We'll never leave. But what's the next question? Is there another question?
This is a kind of comment.
Comments?
No, but yeah.
Okay.
Should answer first the question.
No, we should only. I love the idea that it's a rendezvous of question marks and we don't answer the questions. That's
Exactly.
the idea. That's Carrie's idea.
It's better.
That's good. A rendezvous of question marks. That's what it is.
Well, then I would, of course, start.
Okay. Question. Comment. Because sometimes when we use these terms like rootlessness, and then there's coming a quote in my mind by Zygmunt Bauman, where he makes in a moment of a critical view on what we call the modernity. He said, okay, at a certain point when we're speaking about roots, then we have to speak about the fact that we're losing permanent in the moment all our roots, because every minute, every 10 minutes, a species of this planet is disappearing. So in regard to this, we are in a process where we actually, when we don't expand our thinking in this direction, that we are the only fucking species on this planet who becoming elder and elder and elder. So it's known as one of the most successful concepts how to survive. But on the other side, permanently, other species disappear. And I'm wondering, when he was speaking about this term of the utopian praxis, and you also refer to the second line where you speak more about this environmental discussion, how this could be even a question which is not asked in the museum, but could be what kind of formation of representation in hell we can think for that.
My really question to all of us as institutions is that in a certain moment of when that COVID started and everything was shut down, I saw that also as a chance, because we saw that, as I said before, that this art world is much too precarious, that this idea that it's all about visitor numbers and not about mediation. And I was hoping that maybe we can learn something and that things will change. And I feel that actually we are going back to what was before. And if you think that we somehow, with these moments we had where everything was closed down, where we could rethink our structures, if this could lead to a completely other conceptual of the art institution, being less dependent on commercialization, on all these things which came with neoliberalism. So that is my big question.
And the easiest thing in the world is to do what you know. It's the easiest thing in the world. And why change is so completely difficult. It's why I still smoke cigarettes. So thank you all for this amazing beginning. It continues down the hall. Let's see, just so that I can tell you, there's supposed to be a break that's coming up. But Christian Jones, I think, is down the hall. Tony Osler will be speaking at 3 o'clock. Back in this room at 3 o'clock also, Alex Rader is going to be speaking. And I think in Drill Hall right now, there's a pop-up that's going on with Issa Davis. And we'll be back in this room at 3:30. So see you. Thank you very much for a wonderful morning.
All right, I'm going to just launch in because obviously there's not going to be a giant standing room crowd. I didn't say they were my children. They're my sisters. Okay. All right. My first memory, I got to tell you, this is hilarious. So it might have a whole other meaning now. Okay. But I am going to start. Okay, I'm really going to do it. And you're all going to really listen. Okay. My first memory of politics is an assassination and national tragedy. My father's sister and I were shopping for Hanukkah presents in a department store when it was announced over a loudspeaker that President John F. Kennedy had been shot. I remember quickly exiting the store, my father tearing up behind his Ray-Bans. My family spent the next days glued to TV, the funeral indelibly etched into my young brain. I was 11. By the time Lyndon Johnson escalates the Vietnam War, I'm fully engaged in politics and revolutions in the air. For the Kass family, politics was and will always be an avid avocation. My mother was a passionate FDR Democrat. Dinners at home consisted of heated conversations about the state of the world, about the Vietnam War, my father for, my mother against, and me and my pals closing down our high school for the Vietnam moratorium in 1968. There were no disagreements, however, about civil rights, only horror at the violent, entrenched racism in America, the country that saved lives of my family and people like me, from the pogroms in Eastern Europe 60 years prior, the Holocaust just 20 years past. I worked for anti-war presidential candidate Eugene McCarthy. That spring, Martin Luther King spoke at my junior high in late March. In less than 2 weeks, he was murdered. Then 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy was killed. I was 16. Politics was discussed constantly at home, but there was no interest in the other interest of mine, art. In my house, the only great art ever discussed was the ever-present music of my childhood, jazz. Its improvisations endlessly theorized, then reproduced by my star-struck sax-playing father. To him, a first-generation Jew, artistic geniuses were exclusively black musicians, and jazz literally is America, a lesson that resonated for the rest of my life. Nevertheless, I'm an ambitious teenage artist. I babysit to pay for lessons at the Art Students League in New York City on Saturday mornings, where I draw from life. Since I intend to become a modern artist, I haunt the Museum of Modern Art in the afternoons looking for information about this weird ambition that came out of nowhere when I was 5. What is an artist? How do I become one? I spend countless Saturday afternoons prowling the galleries, wondering what these modern paintings mean and how to parse the importance of the formal paradigm shifts they represent. Looking for clues into this elusive language, I voraciously read books from the bookstore I don't understand. I read that art is universal, but I couldn't help but wonder, what does this art have to do with me? Despite my reading and thinking and looking around MoMA, the temple of my aspiration, my reflection was nowhere to be found. Little did I know back then that this would be the subject of my adult work, and also the work of artists, intellectuals, historians, academics across fields and disciplines for the next 50 years, creating a context for my thinking and the structural, demographic, and political shift that brings us right to the dilemma facing art, museums, and all cultural enterprises now. What is art's relationship to representative democracy? In the 70s, Nixon resigned, Ford told New York to drop dead, and Jimmy Carter served one term. I was busy being in my 20s and becoming who I wanted to be. For me, electoral politics were a blur, but sexual politics was where it was at. When I moved to New York City immediately after college in 1974, second-wave feminism was in full force. Bella Abzug, Gloria Steinem, Barbara Jordan, Shirley Chisholm, Flo Kennedy, and Ms. Magazine were at the center of political discourse. In the 70s, at the height of second-wave feminism, women had enormous political power for the first time, and with it came cultural power. Nochlin wrote Why Are There No Great Women Artists in 1971 and destroyed the traditional frame of all history. In 76, she and Anne Sutherland Harris organized women artists 1550 to 1950 at LACMA, that then traveled to the Brooklyn Museum to the edification of women artists everywhere. In Soho, the new art district, powerful paintings made by women were showing in new galleries. Standing in the Paula Cooper Gallery in a room of Elizabeth Murray paintings in 1976, the proverbial lightning bolt moment changed my understanding of everything I thought about painting. The work felt like a disruptive intervention into what I'd spent my teens trying to understand: abstraction, post-war painting, and ideas of universality. Her paintings were also my first major insight into feminism. For the first time, I felt as if I was the intended audience for a work of art, that I was the subject. That meant the subject had changed. I understood what I was seeing in my body, and here was a paradigm shift I understood. This was new, and wasn't that exactly what art was supposed to be? I was in my early 20s, living in a loft on West Broadway in the still unnamed Tribeca, working at the Broome Street Bar, exactly where I wanted to be, downtown at the intersection of New York School painting and feminism. Surrounded by a new subjectivity in the work of these painters, I found my first female influences: Elizabeth Murray, Mary Heilman, Joan Snyder, Howardina Pindell, Pat Steer, Louise Fishman, and Faith Ringgold. One reason we still know these artists, aside from their greatness, is they got their start at a very fortuitous time to be a woman painter. Art reflects its time. For an ambitious 20-something painter who happened to be female, the future looked very bright indeed. It was an inflection point, not unlike the one we're at right now, with many similarities, including the demand and promise of equality and justice. This was progress, the natural order of things, the inevitable march of expanding equal rights to create a more perfect union. This was what I was taught American history was in the excellent public schools I attended. I was a middle-class white girl, my naivete born of privilege and youth. I'd yet to understand that the fundamental things I learned to take for granted, I could never take for granted as a lesbian. What Black citizens know: unless you're protected by white patriarchy, you are not protected in America. Not your rights, not your body. With the inauguration of Ronald Reagan in 1981, change stopped and turned back in a flash. As women, gays, and people of color were gaining political power, power shifted decisively back to white men. Reagan announced his candidacy in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the scene of the murder, 1964 murder, of voting activists Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, a Black man and 2 Jews. Deploying Nixon's successful Southern strategy, dog whistles, bells, and alarms were blaring and haven't stopped for the next 40-plus years. Reagan promised to make America great again with conservative values, patriarchy, privatization, the end of the fairness doctrine in broadcasting, defunding public education, destroying unions, a war on people of color, women, all civil rights gains, and by changing tax rates. Neoliberal economic theory, trickle-down, shifted the tax burden from the rich directly onto the middle class for the first time since income tax started, creating the oligarchy we live in now. With this radical transfer of wealth from the middle class to the rich got really, really rich really fast, while everyone else got squeezed. Income inequality, not seen since the Gilded Age, was set in motion. Suddenly new money flooded the art world, which changed forever, becoming the unregulated art market of today. And just like in the 70s, art reflected the values of its times. The 80s brought wave after wave of young male art stars, starting with the neo-expressionists. Besides Basquiat, all white, mostly middle class from the suburbs. They made romantic paintings of their ambition, adolescence, and ennui. Simultaneously, major museum leadership shifted to a younger generation, mine. The generation changed, but not the demographic. All white, 99% male, and 40 years later, they're still in charge. Had any of those influential curators and directors promoted the work of people of color or women back then, would they have even been hired and then maintained their jobs for decades? No way. Consciously or not, promoting, securing, maintaining white male supremacy was the job of these institutions. White men made the money and museums followed. Mid-career retrospectives of very young men were organized, pleasing museum trustees who invested in the boy art stars who drove the same cars, smoked the same cigars, lived in the same zip codes, with whom they identified. This male backlash was profoundly shocking. Its embrace a confounding betrayal by the men we went to art school with, befriended downtown, slept with, married, who we thought of as equals. Evidently, they did not. And this was news to me. I was naive. Boy, were they happy to eliminate 50 to 60% of the competition without having to raise a finger, objection, or take any responsibility in pursuit of their preordained success. Systemic racism and sexism were back with a vengeance in the so-called radical 60s generation. In the 80s, the art world passively joined Reagan's active war on women and people of color just by ignoring us. The Guerrilla Girls started broadcasting our collective fury in 1985. In a parallel universe, at the market margins, outside the highly competitive field of expensive painting, conceptual feminist photography and performance, theory and appropriation targeted these regressive narratives and deconstructed power with wit and precision. In retrospect, is there any question about who are the most historically important artists of the 80s? I find my next female influences. Along with Barbara Kruger, Adrienne Piper, Sherry Levine, Cindy Sherman, our queen, Carrie Mae Weems, and Jenny Holzer. Along with these artists throughout the 80s, the supercharged beginnings of feminist literary criticism, postmodernism, multiculturalism, postcolonial studies, queer theory, feminist art history, and something no white person other than Maurice Berger could discuss with me, critical race theory. We're destabilizing entrenched narratives of power, creating radically disruptive interventions into law, literature, art, and history at an astonishing pace. This, I learned, was the work of representation. It was positively thrilling. The primacy of white male subjectivity in master narratives, the canon as we used to call it, was being challenged everywhere across the intellectual landscape. Except in the art world's museums, galleries, and market, especially in the contested practice of painting. In 1989, I began a series called The Art History Paintings in this context, a response to the erasure of the great women painters of the 70s and a complete lack of painting by women of my generation in the 80s. An intervention into the history of modern art and art of my time, informed by the empowering cultural theory that was destabilizing white male supremacy. Deploying multiple recognizable styles from the male modern masters I fell in love with as a teenager and the pop culture I lived in, I created a different narrative. One that interrogated how power and value are created within the languages of painting. How is female absence inscribed in its history? Can the overdetermined act of painting, the veritable sign of male genius, speak for me? Response. Unlike in the movies, there was no reward for speaking truth to power. Among other things, some important relationships ended, and I got my first bad reviews. I'd only gotten good reviews up to that point. And other stuff happened, but I'm saving all that for my memoir. Feel free to laugh. In 1989 to 1992 was Bush I's presidency. The war on drugs, reproductive freedom, and mass incarceration, AIDS, unrelenting attacks on women, people of color, LGBTQ, the environment, poor people, and the middle class continued unabated. Basically, 4 more years of Reagan. We reacted. So much activism happened in response that in the service of time, I'll just say, ACT UP and WHAM, Women's Health Action Mobilization, staged dramatic and effective actions. Personally, during that time, the first Bush regime, I initiated an art auction for NARAL that was the biggest fundraiser they'd had up to that point. I was involved with organizing WAC, Women's Action Coalition, and putting together a panel called Representation and Value, What Role Will the Languages of Feminism Play in the Art World of the 90s, attended by a sold-out crowd at Cooper Union's Great Hall, and curating a show of women painters called Painting Culture that received uniformly great reviews in every paper and magazine, but gained 0 market traction. In 1992, Clinton was elected. My work continued. After years of focusing on my absence in the art history paintings, I began to question exactly where was my presence in art, popular culture, and certainly in the urgent conversation around multiculturalism and representation. So I went back, way back, as a kid. When did I first or ever see my reflection writ large in the bigger world outside my boring New York suburb? What would my presence even look like? A superstar at 22, in 1964, Barbra Streisand took Broadway and the world by storm with her smash Broadway hit Funny Girl. As a young, voracious consumer of popular culture, she blew my mind. She looked nothing like any star I had ever seen. She looked like people I knew. Who was this magical Jewess from Brooklyn? I'd never noticed my absence, as so few of us did back then, until I saw my presence. I was 12 or 13 when I first saw myself reflected in the culture, and her name was Barbara. And it got even better. My parents couldn't stand her. Why wouldn't she change her name or her nose? She was too Jewish. Barely an adult, Barbara knew her destiny. She was the greatest star. She won her first Tony Award at 20, her second at 22. By 23, she demanded and got creative control over her 3 upcoming award-winning TV specials. By the time she was 25, if you have children, you know what they're like now. At 25, she had 4 Emmys, 10 Grammys, and 2 Tonys. At 27, the Oscar, becoming the youngest EGOT ever. Her self-regard was a revolution. Her agency, a disruptive liberation. Her confidence, ambition, IQ, all a radical challenge to showbiz, traditional gender roles, and male supremacy. Her over-the-top talent, her name, even her nose, was a revolution in self-expression, self-love, Jewish pride, and feminist consciousness before feminism. Streisand's understanding of the power and glamour of her difference was a revelation and superseded all academic theorizing of difference by decades. For those of us who deviated from the norm, who felt different, who looked different, she was a beacon. I wanted to be her. I identified completely, and if she could do it, then so could I. In 1992, I wrote, Andy was the first queer artist who spoke directly about male homosexual desire in a public way. He and Barbara stood outside the mainstream culture. She is a Jewish woman, he is an out gay man. He subverted the myths of macho post-war American painting and invented pop art. She gained control of her own Hollywood projects before any female star and made the movie Yentl before queer theory ever hit a university. Andy was a pop artist, pop as in populist like Irving Berlin, not like Donald Trump. His style was ubiquitous, through which I felt I could speak very directly. In the spring of '92, I first silk screened an image of Barbra Streisand on painted backgrounds, and I knew I hit it. Here, indeed, was my presence. I was fully representing. Still, I knew I needed to complicate the instant digestibility of this deceptively simple bonbon of an image and deepen its meaning even further. Streisand's Yentl was the first movie ever written, directed, produced, and starred in by a woman. It was released in 1983. After years of famously arguing with male directors, Barbara was finally fulfilling her creative destiny by doing it all. She'd been pitching the movie since she was in her 20s, for 15 years, and at last approved only if she agreed to sing in it. She made it when she was 40, the same age I was when I started using her image. Taken from a story by Isaac Bashevis Singer, it's the tale of Yentl, the only child of a widowed Torah scholar in an Eastern European shtetl. Because teaching females was strictly prohibited by Jewish law, he instructs his daughter in the sacred texts of Judaism behind closed windows. Of course, she's his most brilliant student, fearlessly questioning and debating the ancient texts. When her father dies, the only way she can continue her passion to study is to leave home, cut her hair, don men's clothes, and study as a young man in a yeshiva far, far away. Of all the stories, this was the one Streisand was obsessed with telling. Again, decades before queer theory. Yentl in drag in order to study sacred texts. I thought, this was the perfect metaphor for what I was doing in my work. You would think that the Jewish community that was the backbone of contemporary art in New York at that time, 80s and 90s, would embrace work that spoke directly to them and about them. But for collectors, older Jews of my parents' generation, who would now be great-grandparents, the problems of visibility 50 years after Auschwitz, fear, and internalized anti-Semitism were too much for them to overcome. Barbara had been a Hollywood institution for 30 years already. By that point, most of these people, even my mother, considered themselves really big fans. But the image of proud Jewish difference, that was Barbara, freaked them out, and I was really shocked. Maybe they found my work so offensive because it was a sign of their difference at an active site of their assimilation, contemporary art. One Jewish art consultant walked into my show and pronounced it bad for the Jews. A Jewish collector, too Jewish. A third, very influential art consultant who sold and collected every white man of the 80s, called to excoriate me for, quote, doing our dirty laundry in public, the Jews hate Barbara, unquote. For them, first-generation children of immigrants, the goal was assimilation. But for my generation, it was representation. People my age, the gays, the Jews, women, knew Barbara and I were disrupting and representing. The power of identification should never be underestimated. With them, the work was an unequivocal hit. The show got a rave review by Holland Cotter in the New York Times, but there was no support from my local institutions, who were still mainly promoting the work of white men. The work was not included in the historic Multicultural Whitney Biennial in 1993. To some of us, the omission of any Jewish identity in the first biennial devoted to identity was extremely problematic. It helped inspire the important and controversial 1996 exhibition Too Jewish at the Jewish Museum, curated by the great Norman Kleeblatt. 3 months before the biennial, in January 1993, the last week of my show, Bill Clinton was inaugurated. The ever politically conscious Barbara represented, looking gorgeous in Donna Karan, serenading him and the country with 3 songs by 3 Jews. Her own song Evergreen from the movie A Star is Born, Stephen Sondheim's Children Will Listen from the Broadway musical Into the Woods, and Irving Berlin's God Bless America. Amazingly, no one uttered the words "too Jewish." During the relative quiet of the 8 years of the Clinton presidency, as he pulled us out of debt incurred by Reagan's economic policies and into solvency and surplus, I continued to flesh out the Warhol Project using images of my feminist and ethnic sheroes and heroes. Great artists, art historians, curators, and one Jewish superstar athlete. And then the inevitable self-portraits as Andy, and lastly, now in a different drag, to end my Warhol project in 2000 for the first time, not as Andy, but as the great Jewish icon, Liz Taylor. In 1999, on the plane to New Orleans, the birthplace of jazz, for the first comprehensive presentation of the Warhol project, I had a revelation. Having grown up with jazz as the creative model, I had unconsciously applied it to painting. My method was as close to jazz as it could be, riffing on pop standards, giving the familiar melodies new meanings. I've been creatively happily married to Andy from 92 to 2000, but it was time to move on. The Bush-Cheney administrations, 2001 to 9, brought back the same old cynical Republican reprise. Attacks on women, people of color, the poor, unions, public education, middle class, tax cuts for the 1%, more trickle-down economics, creating more income inequality, privatization, lies, environmental disasters, corruption, and stolen elections. 9/11 brought disaster capitalism, the shock doctrine, extra-legal torture, dark sites, Guantanamo, and endless wars. I was turning 50 and wanted to paint again, and I was thinking about all my influences. My first loves at MoMA, the feminist painters of the 70s, where I first saw my own subjectivity in painting, the feminist postmodern photographers and conceptual artists of the 80s, who informed my strategies and content. I wanted the paintings to make specific references to my generation and class. Lyrics from Broadway musicals, disco, pop music, and the American Songbook, movies, the great post-war philosophers, Stephen Sondheim, Sylvester, my grandmother's Jeannie Koufax, and others, with a variety of modernist winks and nods. I hope to deploy nostalgia in a new way, to political ends, identification and accessibility being the key. The references in form and content would be nostalgic for a more optimistic age. Post-war America that produced the great art, movies, and music I grew up loving, but as double-edged as possible to acknowledge that the very conditions that produced them, democracy and the American dream, were in trouble. The political situation demanded I widen the lens. How can my paintings, my work, respond to my times? Bush's failed attempt to privatize Social Security exposed again the Republican scheme of selling off our commons to private companies and individuals, permanently establishing an oligarchy, a ruling class of white men. In 2001, Bush withdrew from the 1992 Kyoto Protocol. After 9/11, Halliburton and private mercenaries ran our foreign policy. Bush and co. privatized war for profit and employed medieval torture in our name. America's moral leadership, whatever that once meant, went to its precipitous decline. I was reminded again during Bush that power's most salient expression is its abuse. Democracy and the rule of law were in serious peril. The American dream was broken. Artists who showed in galleries at the time were overwhelmingly white and middle class from the suburbs, and like me, wildly embarrassed by it. But as Republican policies ensured that the rich cannibalized the middle class through shifted tax burdens, and I started to see things very differently. After World War II, the GI Bill paid for white men like my father, children of poor and working class immigrants, to attend public universities for the first time. Although still not available to women or people of color, this historic social engineering created economic mobility that had simply never existed before, making financial stability accessible to more of the population by growing the middle class. Given this opportunity, many rose through public education to become doctors, lawyers, and professors. Also, artists, musicians, designers, who, along with black musical geniuses, produced the very best advertisement ever for democracy, and America's most influential and enduring export, American culture, everything from music to art to blue jeans. Since Reagan, had the ultimate Republican scheme all along been to destroy the equal opportunity and social mobility that defines the American dream and democracy for once and for all? The Bush-Cheney regime grinds on. After 8 horrendous years, the Bush era finally ends. In 2008, Obama is elected. Hope and change are on the horizon. Optimism returns after 8 very long, very dark years. Hallelujah. But a week after he's inaugurated, Mitch McConnell announces his intention to make Obama one-term president in the most brazen display of white supremacy, shamelessly using the language of masters and slaves, proclaiming, "We are going to break him." In that moment, I yet again get a whole new understanding of the Republican project. These white men, the minority, their power threatened, will do anything to maintain it, including disgrace themselves. Shame is jettisoned in the quest for power. Just a hint of what was to come. Hope is in trouble. Midterms and the Tea Party bring any hope of progress to a standstill, as Republicans block every single initiative, no matter how good for the people. The country's at an impasse it still occupies today. In 2010, the unrelenting BP oil spill goes on, poisoning the Gulf of Mexico day after day after day. But meanwhile, 2 of the most elegant, gorgeous, and coolest young people to ever occupy the White House inspire us daily. Their public celebration of Black excellence centers Blackness not only in the halls of power, but firmly within the American story. For the first time, the most diverse administration ever looks like the country it represents. For the vast majority of Americans, it's a joy to behold. Civic pride abounds. The White House is filled with art by women and people of color. Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherald paint the Obamas' glamorous portraits. Michelle declares Hamilton, the musical created by Lin-Manuel Miranda, son of Puerto Rican parents, the best work of art she's ever experienced. Me and millions of others agree 100%. Kids know every word of Hamilton, and can wrap the arcane debate over federal debt in the exact same way I knew every aspirational word of Funny Girl, Fiddler on the Roof, and Mame, all written by the sons of Jewish immigrants. The Obamas make musicals great again. The cast of Hamilton performs at the White House. Obama presents Sondheim and Streisand the Medals of Freedom. This is what democracy looks like. If we can see it, we can be it. In 2015, the same year Hamilton opens at the Public Theater, I create my own ode to democracy, something that speaks to more people than I ever imagined I could. I had the opportunity, so rare for a woman artist, to make a monumental sculpture. It's Spanish, it's Yiddish, it's black and white slang, it's Cockney, Japanese, it says hello, hey, it's me, I'm here, and uh-oh, all at once. So many communities identify with and embrace it as they see themselves writ large on the waterfront in Dumbo. It becomes the place for wedding, quinceañeras, school, camp, and all kinds of photos. Once when I was visiting, there was a proposal. The photographer ready, friends waiting behind the Oyo with champagne and balloons. It's a joy. I'm still blown away by this image. This is Black Trans Lives Matters during COVID, 10,000. I'm still blown away by this. To see 10,000 of my brothers and sisters in power and love, surrounding my work, the best of myself. I can barely ever say this when I say this, but it really makes me cry. It makes me totally verklempt. In the meantime, Republicans work in earnest to undo the remnants of the New Deal. 2012, Newtown Elementary School shooting. 2013, Voting Rights Act is struck down by the right-wing Supreme Court. In response, I start a new series called No Kidding, because things are dire. More mass shootings, Democrats are powerless to stop them, the Russian-funded NRA is buying off Republicans, children are being massacred at school. There's an overt war on black bodies by the state. Because of cell phones and social media, the appalling images are inescapable. Black people are being routinely murdered by police and white men while praying, driving, walking, sleeping, breathing. Is this a reaction to our first brilliant, elegant, sophisticated black president? Of course it is. The display of black excellence and diversity he and the First Lady celebrate in the White House, is it too much for white supremacy to stomach? For one hot minute during these dire times, there was something going on in the art world called crapstraction. Knowingly meaningless, color field-like paintings being made by young white men. The auction market was crazy and pieces were being flipped, hundreds of thousands of dollars being made overnight by older white men. A Hail Mary pass for fame and fortune. This cynical work seemed like the height of white male privilege and arrogance. So I did a few paintings to respond. It also seemed like an insult during the Republican war on the rest of us. The disconnect between real life and the art world was atrocious. It's 2016. Hillary Rodham Clinton has been on my radar since I was 17 in 1969, when she was the first student to ever give a commencement address at Wellesley. It was so exceptional an event, it was covered on the news and in Life magazine. Now it's 2016. Hillary Rodham Clinton wins the nomination and is finally getting her shot. History made. The most qualified candidate ever to run for president. She's brilliant, indefatigable, tough as nails, been through the ringer, and now, through grit, brains, and the desire to do her best for as many people as possible, for as long as possible, is going to triumph over every obstacle she's ever faced. Hers is the classic Shiro story. She is mine. 50 years after second-wave feminism, I too will finally see my reflection in the most powerful human on the planet, the President of the United States. Art by women of every ethnicity, color, gender will be hanging in the White House. In the same way the Obamas spotlighted the lack of diversity in museums, an initiative whose results are very much with us now, perhaps Hillary's administration will jumpstart the conversation about the still abysmal lack of women artists represented in American museum collections. And I have every reason to believe she will. I hope for change. I dust off the Warhol Project after 16 years to produce the official print for the Hillary Rodham Clinton campaign, and honestly, I have never been prouder. It's the exact same size as Andy's Vote McGovern, for whom I voted in my first presidential election in 1972. Same edition size, same price as his, $1,000, and not adjusted for inflation. They sell like hotcakes, make a ton of money for the campaign, and I'm invited to the convention in Philadelphia in July. 2016 is the best summer of my life. The divine Sarah Lewis and I spent hours watching history being made the first night of the convention. The next night, sitting in the bar at the Ritz, in the room where it happens, I spot Cecile Richards, Jerry Nadler, Mika, Joe, congressmen and women. My dear friend Amy, Nadler's chief of staff, is waving from across the crowded room. I get in an elevator with Mike Barnacle. For a political junkie, it's pure Democratic heaven. I'm told, book your hotel, you're coming to the inauguration. So I do. In August, I meet Hillary at a tiny gathering. I'm in total fangirl meltdown and have no idea what we talk about. I ask my wife, who tells me, the print, you talked about the print. In September, Art for Hillary raises more money for the campaign. Then Broadway for Hillary. In October, I'm invited to her birthday party a week before the election. Hillary is a Scorpio, by the way. Stevie Wonder leads us in Happy Birthday. Everything's coming up roses. I'm 100% sure of the polls, and I spend months leading up to the election talking three of my very smartest friends off the ledge. They have doubts. I have none. Invited to various election night parties, we choose to stay home, where Patty and I can quietly watch the world change for good. When Hillary Clinton becomes the first woman president, no way I'm leaving home. We can't be in public. It's too big. It's too emotional. Everything we've worked for our entire lives will come to be. Imagine representation, value, power. Our feminist future is finally here. Talk about broken dreams. Our collective nightmare begins. The Republican attack on the majority of us and representative democracy and dream of white male oligarchy reaches its inevitable apotheosis in the form of the corrupt Russian asset and spoiled brat. I have to do that again because it's good. Its inevitable apotheosis in the form of the corrupt Russian asset and spoiled brat from Queens, the abjectly stupid, the ignorant vulgarian, aspiring autocrat, Donald Trump. Narcissist, misogynist, tax cheat, money launderer, racist, rapist, mobbed-up sociopath, and New York City punchline. Depravity and disease follow. The historian Timothy Snyder publishes his book on tyranny and lists the signs of incipient authoritarianism. We recognize them immediately. The lies begin day one. The assault on reality, truth, the rule of law, the government itself, classic autocracy. Painting, art, gesture seems empty. Style, irrelevant. This is not a time for nuance. I just strip it down to basics. His administration looks like America in 1850. As Steve Bannon promised, they proceed to dismantle the administrative state. Every single department, From national security to state to EPA and agriculture, expertise is fired or forced out. The institutional memory and regulations that protect us are trash. The goal is autocracy, corruption, and chaos. The motive, pure greed. Trump's financial conflicts of interest are monetized. The director of the Office of Government Ethics quits in protest. Our government stops functioning. We are unprotected and defenseless. While picking our pockets, Trump's distractions are classic. Right out of the fascist playbook and Snyder's List, the scapegoating begins in earnest. Muslims are banned from entering the country. Immigrant children, infants, are kidnapped by our government, never to see their parents again. Crimes against humanity in our name. Our moral compasses are going haywire. Our moral standing in the world forever lost. Destabilizing everything is the point, and 20th century European fascist history comes to American soil. There are Nazis running through Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Killing a woman. There's a massacre of 11 Jews in an upscale Pittsburgh neighborhood synagogue. And if you know Pittsburgh and Squirrel Hill, like I happen to, it's so deep. White men, a minority, terrorize the rest of us. Their grievance unleashed, they target everyone who isn't them. Can a woman get health care without being prosecuted? Can a child go to school without getting shot? Can queers go to their local bar? Can a black citizen do anything? Can anyone go to a concert or church without getting killed by a white man with a gun? Toxic masculinity takes on even more lethal meaning. White male supremacy is being violently enforced, and they have the guns. The majority of Americans, women, children, and everyone who's not white, straight, or a white, straight man, are living in fear. For many white people, whether they know it or not, they're experiencing what it is like to be black in America for the very first time. In 2017, Putin's puppet withdraws from the Paris Climate Accord. All my reading and thinking about history has prepared me to recognize exactly what I'm living through. Oh, I said that wrong. I'm going to do it again. All my reading and thinking about history has prepared me to recognize exactly what I'm seeing, but nothing has prepared me to live through it in real life. Nothing. Citizens respond. Millions turn up the day after the inauguration for the Women's March, then at airports to protest the Muslim ban. The Parkland Kids March for Our Lives, Black Lives Matters, Me Too, immigration reform. Chaos rules, nihilism, and exhaustion. Then a pandemic. Now he's killing us with chaos and stupidity, with lies, literally hundreds of thousands of us, more crimes against humanity. Is this genocide? Psychic, political, and now physical survival becomes our work. We're locked down, and life as we know it stops. Everything stops but lies, death, and corruption. And Zoom. Here, I want to thank two fabulous friends, the inimitable Ruby Lerner and the remarkable artist who so generously brings us together here at the Armory, Carrie Mae Weems, our spiritual leader. Our weekly Friday night Zoom quarantinis were a lifesaver. Our conversations centering, of course, on Trump. Could democracy survive? Would Joe pull it out? Will COVID ever end? And brainstorming, what can citizens do? What can artists do? Representation and equity are a matter of life and death for democracy. Truth is a matter of life and death in the pandemic. Joe and Kamala win. There's a woman of color in the White House. Black voters save the republic again. We exhale. but the reaction is immediate. Violent insurrection and treason based on lies. And now we hold our breath again for answers to the questions so many Americans are asking in one way or another that Carrie poses so exquisitely here at the Armory. Is this the end of empire? Will human nature be the death of us all? Having gone this far past reason, are humans capable of coming back to common sense? The vaccine rollout has been extraordinary, but will the unhinged minority kill us by not taking it? If the vast majority of Americans want abortion and voting rights, gun control, universal health care, good public education, why don't we have them? Will the Democrats be able to change tax laws to once again to favor our labor over their wealth? Is the American dream over? Are we majority or minority rule? Will political violence in the service of white male supremacy win? Will white men continue to hunt women, protesters, Democrats, worshipers, and children? Will my marriage be annulled by the state? Who owns my body? Are Trump and his treasonous co-conspirators above the law, or will the rule of law prevail? Can all citizens vote? Will a complex, diverse democracy survive the white Republican minority's authoritarian assault? E pluribus unum. What does art have to do with democracy? With democracy in the balance, who is art for? Thanks. Thanks.